I'm live. Oh, what is that? I'm sitting here with a cat on my lap. I'm wondering whether I should just stop this and start again. No, I won't. I'll just leave it as it is and skip it. And skip it and start again here. Right. Good morning. I'm reading Chapter 6 of Prelude to the Landing on Planet Earth. Chapter 6 is Ambassadors Extraordinary. This is an account of a journey in the Middle East in the 70s and was published in 1977 by Stuart Holroyd. It is, we have assembled the trio which are working on guidance of extraterrestrials. And we are here in chapter 6, as I said, Ambassadors Extraordinary. If any imagination invented the tale this chapter is going to tell, it was an imagination of extraordinary audacity and with a well-developed sense of melodrama. Melodramatic, yes, and apparently chaotic were the activities of Andrija, John and Phyllis in November-December 1974. To venture out into the world in order to set things right, to attempt to turn the tide of historical events, to move heroically through a world of hazard and adventure superimposed on the world of ordinary reality. It was by virtue of such actions that Cervantes' hero won immortality as an epithet in all the European languages. But poor Don Quixote was deluded, was a noble fantasist, and all the hazards that he faced and the heroism he manifested were of his own imaginings. Whether the same was true of our trio when they embarked on their first mission to the Middle East at the behest of the management is more of an open question than that of the Don's insanity. It was on the 2nd November that John, Andrija and Phyllis reassembled at Ossining. John came from London and Phyllis from Florida, and they came earlier than they had planned, for Andrija had phoned them both to say that the management required them to work again. He himself had been working with 2 other psychics in the interim, which was how he knew, for a message had come through one of them that the international situation was getting worse and the trio ought to be back in harness. Andrija had continued to work independently with other psychics throughout the period of the Tom communications, one of whom had channeled some highly complex and interesting scientific material, again allegedly from an extraterrestrial source. In a session held during the week John and Phyllis were away, information had been channeled that corresponded with that of recent communications with Tom, speaking of Ashand, the civilization concerned with creativity, and also of the threatening war situation in the Middle East, which by the end of October had apparently become so serious as to warrant the funneling of some positive, balancing energy into the area. One didn't have to possess paranormal faculties or special sources of information to know that there was tension in the Middle East situation at this time, for during the last days of October, the leaders of the Arab nation had held their summit conference at Rabat, Morocco, and European and American newspapers had carried reports of their decisions. The most controversial and provocative of these was a decision to recognize the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, as official spokesman for the Palestinian Arabs. The Israeli government regarded the PLO as a bunch of bandits and murderers and refused to consider ever negotiating with them. So the Arab decision was regarded as, one Israeli official put it, as counterproductive. On the 1st of November, the London Times carried a headline: Israel puts troops on exercise as precaution, and reported ominous troop movements in the disputed Golan Heights territory, which had been annexed from Syria in the War of October 1973. The same report stated that American diplomats are concerned over the fatalistic talk of a new war in Israel in the wake of Rabat. And the Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Rabin, publicly stated that only the United States could act as an intermediary in the Middle East, for the European countries were all pro-Arab on account of their oil interests. Arrangements were hurriedly made for the U.S. Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, to visit the Middle East in the course of the next week. So the Middle East crisis was public knowledge by the beginning of November, and the information that brought John and Phyllis back to Ascending could just as well have been read in the newspapers as channeled from an extraterrestrial source. But if there was nothing particularly remarkable about the recognition of the state of emergency at this time, the fact that it had been predicted by Tom nearly 3 weeks before was impressive, for there had been little about the Middle East in the news at the time. Moreover, his prediction that the worst crisis period was to begin on the 8th of November was, as we shall see, not far off the mark, though he would have been closer if he had made it a few days earlier. We explained to you before about the explosive situation in the Middle East, Tom said at the beginning of the first communication they held at Ossining after their return. We thought that perhaps we could hold, but we cannot. He went on to say that at present there were negotiations taking place which were not going well, and that on the 4th of November the decisions would be made in the US concerning oil, which, if put into effect, would precipitate a war. And as we have told you before, your nation with the Russian and the Chinese will be drawn into it, and it will be a major war, Tom warned. The ideological and border disputes of the Russians and the Chinese had direct bearing upon the Middle East situation, for if they came to a head, the Chinese would support and incite the Arabs and upset the balance of power in the most politically sensitive area of the world. We know what needs to be done, Tom said, but it is perhaps not possible. And he put to them the protocol that they should make 2 trips. The first, keeping within a 1,500-mile distance of Moscow in order to have a stabilizing influence on the Russian leaders, and the second to Israel, where it was of vital importance that they should be between the 5th and the 13th of December. Between the trips, Tom said, they must be in Ossining for the period of the 18th to the 22nd of November, for this was the time allotted for the TV and radio intervention project, and their energies would be needed for that. Can you arrange it? He asked. Daunted by neither the expense nor the awesome responsibility laid upon them, John and Andrija said they could. We've been looking at maps, Andrija said at the beginning of the next day's communication, and we've found out those places that are within 1,500 miles of Moscow, and we have the feeling, at least I do, that this is to some extent a test. A test exercise to see how well we can operate at such short notice in foreign circumstances. One of the possibilities is that we could move from country to country around the perimeter of Russia. Tom interrupted. We have told you many times that your thoughts are not your own, but there is one exception in this. It is not a test. Your moving is very important, because remember, every time you move, whether it be 500, 150 or 5 of your miles, it then overlays. Do you understand? When you have been in an area for 28 to 48 hours, afterwards the trace of you, of the 3 of you, remains. Andrija said, so if I may interpret what you say, if we could make a sweep, an arc, around the Soviet capital from the north and all the way to as far south and east as we can get conveniently, this will leave a trace around which will keep radiating. Is that the idea? Andrija said, so if I may, so Tom said he was right, and John asked what difference it made with regard to intensity of influence to be actually in a place, for instance, Moscow. Tom answered in effect that the intensity was in proportion to the proximity, which was the reason why they were here, within a few hundred miles of the US capital, and also why they had been asked to go to Israel, and if they could arrange to actually go to Moscow, it would be so much the better. So the route decided on was to begin at Helsinki, proceed by way of Warsaw and Ankara to Tehran, then fly north to Moscow itself, and return to the US with a stopover in Copenhagen. Can you arrange to be in the Soviet by the 10th of November, Tom said. They said they'd try, though the travel and visa arrangements were complicated and would take some days to complete. Dr. Henry Kissinger, of course, didn't have visa problems, and he was able to fly to the Middle East without much delay. He was unaware, as he jetted from Cairo to Riyadh and then to Jerusalem, that back home near New York, 3 people were daily meditating in a sealed metal box in order to channel energy that would protect him as he pursued his peacekeeping mission. This they did on Tom's instructions, for Kissinger, he said, was in danger of assassination, and there was nobody who could replace him at that present time. Your nation is no longer running on an intellectual plane, it is running on an emotional plane, he said, and predicted that within 6 of your months there will be a problem with your Dr. Kissinger, simply because those in office that will be operating emotionally will not understand the intellectual and will plot to discredit and remove him. When they had arranged their itinerary, John and Andrija found that en route between Ankara and Tehran they had a wait of about an hour at Beirut airport, and John asked if they could do anything to help Israel's situation at this time. Tom said, the fact that you are in the area creates a blanket, and instructed them to sit in meditation in the transit lounge during the hour they spent at Beirut. Again, he stressed how critical the situation was, saying, the danger to Israel, if allowed to develop, will cause what you call a major confrontation, and it will be the beginning of the end. By a major confrontation, they ascertained he meant a nuclear war. At present, this was the 5th November 1974, the day Kissinger was conferring with President Sadat in Cairo, Tom said, the probability of war taking place was as high as 90%. But as in all of your worldly situations, this may be changed. Do you think there is a real chance that we are there at the proper time? We can help to keep it down to minor local skirmishes? Andrija asked. Yes, Tom said. Your presence would do that, because of the vortex of the 3. Andrija asked whether, if the situation got worse, they should not spend time in Israel on their first trip, returning from Tehran that way, instead of through Moscow. But Tom said, it is important that you go to Moscow. Within the time you will be in the area, and for 4 days afterwards, there will be major decisions made. The reason for you being in the area is to reverse some of the decisions that some of the Council of Soviet Russia would like to make. By your presence you will bring light and sanity. So on the 7th November, the peace mission of the scientist, the psychic, and the aristocrat set out from Kennedy Airport on the first leg of their journey, destination Helsinki. And a motley trio they must have looked. John wearing the blue tracksuit he often traveled in and carrying his only luggage, a shoulder bag. Andrija still managing to look professional, even in a blue denim suit. Phyllis encumbered with 3 suitcases and looking like any middle-aged American tourist during Europe. The suitcases irritated John, who believed in traveling light, and so did Andrija's insistence on carrying with him a load of gadgetry for photography and recording. He reflected that under normal circumstances none of them would have chosen either of the others as a traveling companion, but this was no holiday. So I stop this here for now and continue it soon. It's Sunday.